Hello. It is good to see you today. My name is Dave. I want to start by welcoming our churches. I want to welcome all of you watching online or listening online. We love you, and we are glad to have you part of the Eastlake community. So, like Andy said, I was on staff here for a couple of years, back in 2003 to 2006. I've got lots of connections to this church. One of the connections is Pastor James and I have been best friends for more than 30 years. And I know that there is a picture that he showed just a couple of months ago in one of the services about when James and I used to travel together. All right, so here's the deal. When we were in college, we had opportunities to speak at camps and churches, but we were like self-promoters, so we went and got glamour shots together. I kid you not, this is not making this up. Here's the pictures that James and I got together, and then we would send it out to pastors saying, hey, will you have us come speak? And we never had any real friends that said, don't do that. That's just weird, right? But so we've stayed friends over the years. He was on staff at Eastlake just a couple of months before I was. And when I joined, I was life development pastor overseeing children's ministries, student ministries. At the time, Pastor Mike Meeks was the lead pastor. I was in my late 20s, and Mike saw something in me, took a risk on me, believed in me, and started teaching me leadership. Was a mentor to me in many, many ways, holds a deep place in my heart. And he has played that grandfather role. And that's how I viewed him. I actually ran into him today, which was good because I hadn't seen him in a while. I was like, is he still alive? Is he still around here? But he is, and we're glad about that. Without a doubt, guys, without a doubt, I know it sounds like, you're supposed to say this. The best years of my life were when my wife and I were here in San Diego. And then what happened is in 2006, we moved to Seattle for a short season. And then 2009, I moved back to my hometown, Kenosha, Wisconsin. All right? If you haven't been to Kenosha, it is a tropical paradise. So start planning your vacation right now. But we moved back there to start Great Lakes Church. And being in my hometown is a big deal to me. But the reason I tell you that was because Eastlake Church, through your annual Christmas offering, you invested in us financially, you got behind us, you support us, and you helped us launch in a really big way. And so today what we have is 2 campuses. Every year we invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into different ministries here, near, and far. We've helped start several churches, and we are going strong. And I tell you that because you believed in us when we were just a dream, so thank you. And I know I'm just one story of many stories. One story of many. You are making a difference. I think that's all you need. One more thing. My family. Here we go. Here is my wife and I. We've been married for 26 years. We have 2 amazing kids and another one. That's all you need to know, right? So I do appreciate the invite to be here and to launch this 2-week series on grief. That's what we're doing. We're just talking about grief. It's something, of course, that we all relate to and all go through. About a year ago, I had a retired couple stop me in the lobby of our church, and they said, hey, Pastor Dave, do you officiate wedding ceremonies? And I knew what they were going to ask next. They were asking me to marry them because I knew they had been dating. I didn't know their names. I just had seen them around. And so I kind of quickly put a stop to that. And I said, hey, I do officiate ceremonies. I said, just, that with the busyness of the church and traveling, I really only officiate for family and close friends. But here's the deal. If you email me with the details of your wedding and ceremony and the dates and all that stuff, what I'll do is I'll forward it to the different pastors on staff, and someone will officiate for you. I can guarantee it. And so a couple days later, they send me the email, say, here's the details you asked for. Our wedding ceremony is going to be at Disney World in Florida. We're willing to pay for a pastor and their spouse to fly down. We're going to put them up at a resort for 4 days, plus give them money to go to the parks. So as you can imagine, my wife and I had a great time in Orlando. You know that's right. I actually emailed the couple back, I kid you not, and I said, you should have told me the details in the lobby. I would not want to miss out on your big day. I am here to celebrate with you. Well, here's the deal. When you go to Disney World, inevitably at some point, you're going to drive underneath a bridge or a sign that says, the most magical place on earth. Right? It's a sign that reminds you this is a place you can escape. And the reason it's magical and the reason Disney plays on magic is because they understand we all need a time and a place where we escape the stresses of life, the difficulties of life, the challenges of life, the problems that are overwhelming us. But of course, we all know you can only escape for so long. Eventually, we all have to return to the real world. And the real world has difficulty, and it has challenges, and it has losses. And so Jesus, on one occasion, he's talking with his disciples, and he says in a very straightforward way, I want you to know, in this world, you will have trouble. And obviously, the kind of trouble Jesus was talking about wasn't the, well, I can't get my car started kind of trouble. That's a challenge, right? It's an inconvenience, but that's not what he was talking about. He wasn't talking about, oh, my Wi-Fi is giving me problems kind of trouble, right? He wasn't talking about, oh, my favorite football team picked up and moved to a bigger city type of problems, right? The kind of trouble that Jesus was talking about was the kind of trouble that leaves us with more questions than answers. The kind of trouble that causes us to question everything we've ever believed in. The kind of trouble that Jesus was talking about is a kind of trouble that reduces everything we've spent time building and investing in and reduces it to a pile of ashes. The kind of trouble that Jesus was talking about was a kind of trouble that doesn't allow us to summarize our faith on a bumper sticker with a nice quote or a cute little slogan. So Jesus said, in this world, you can expect it. You will have trouble. Nobody is exempt, which means everyone has a story of loss. If we had time to hand a microphone around, not only would we all have a story of loss, we'd have multiple stories of loss. Maybe it's a story of a job loss or the loss of a career that you were putting your heart into and things change and you're no longer in that career. Or the loss of a friendship and consequently other friendships that were attached to that. Maybe it's the loss of a close family. We thought, man, we always get together and it's one big party and then some things happen and you feel divided. Maybe it's the loss of health. You're not able to enjoy the same things you used to enjoy. Maybe it's the loss of a marriage. In fact, I know that's a story for so many. For some, it's the loss of a dream. Right? I got friends who they spent years of their life dreaming about having biological children, and this is what they wanted. They wanted this family together, and then the doctor told them, hey, that's not going to be possible. I have friends who during the pandemic, their dream of a business just kind of fizzled. They had to shut their doors. For some, it's the loss of a childhood. You hear people talk about their childhood as though it was almost magical, some fantasy world, and you're looking at your childhood thinking, man, I was robbed of a childhood. For some, it's the loss of innocence. Things happen to you that should never have happened. Over the last 2 years, many people have lost out on opportunities. Whether it's graduation ceremonies or summer camps or birthday parties or vacations, everyone has a story of loss. Nobody is exempt. The biggest loss that I ever experienced in my life took place April 14th, 2008. And that was the day that a group of Marines wearing their dress blue showed up to my parents' house unannounced. And as they were making their way up the driveway, my mom happened to see them out of the big window in her living room. And as a mother, she quickly connected the dots in her mind. She knew why they were there. She immediately starts breaking down. She starts screaming. She starts yelling, calling out to my dad, who happened to be in another part of the house. And then they knocked on the door, and she says, I couldn't answer it. I was frozen. I couldn't answer it. And I'm yelling, and my dad finally joins her. He sees what's happening. He connects the dots, and he says, we're not going to make any assumptions. But sure enough, they opened the door, and they heard those dreaded words, right? We're here on behalf of the Marines. We regret to inform you. They went on to explain that my brother, Rick, who had been serving in Iraq, that he would not be coming home. And that he would be coming home, but it'd be in a body bag. And of course, they used much more formal language. But he'd been killed by a roadside bomb. And then to compound what the news they had just heard, this happened just 1 week shy of Rick's wedding anniversary, his first one. And so it launched our family into a season we never anticipated. Now, at the time, I was living in Seattle, and my mom calls me, and she says in the first couple of sentences, hey, Dave, I hate to tell you this. Your brother went home to be with Jesus. And it's hard to explain when you hear something like that, the emotions But I became so overwhelmed, I literally just hung up on her, didn't even say anything. Hung up on her, started screaming, oh God, no, oh God, no. And then I realized I don't have any details, so I call her back, and I can't get a hold of her, and just chaos. But everybody has a story of loss. Nobody is exempt, and what I want to anchor in on today and spend some time talking about is regardless of what loss you've experienced recently in your life or the series of losses you've gone through, it is essential that we grieve our losses. It's essential that we recognize them and see them and take time to grieve them, because to grieve a loss means, hey, I'm recognizing this was important. I'm recognizing this thing had value. I'm acknowledging it had meaning in my life. I'm not ignoring it. So when Jesus has a good friend of his, Lazarus, die, the response of Jesus is summarized in just 3 words. Then Jesus wept. In other words, he was heartbroken. He didn't ignore his emotions, right? He's distraught, and he grieved. Grief is a natural, predictable, and unavoidable response to loss. Most people, they equate loss with sadness. Totally understandable. Most of the time, that is the primary emotion, but it's so much more than that, right? Grief can include anger. It can include fear or guilt, resentment, anxiety. In our Bible, we have the story of a guy by the name of Job. Job was a good man. He was a godly man. And in a short season, he went through incredible loss in his life. He went through financial loss. He went through the loss of his health. He was experiencing the loss of his children to death. I mean, just crazy amounts of loss in this guy, an avalanche of losses. And it's in this season that he expresses anguish. He cries out, if my misery could be weighed and my troubles be put on the scales, they would outweigh all the sands of the sea. He says, I'm overwhelmed. I can't carry this. Right? We've all gone through those losses where it just feels like, I don't want to get up anymore. Matter of fact, I can't get up anymore. I can't keep doing this. King David of Israel, he goes through loss after loss after loss in his life, and at one point he just starts crying out with questions to God. Here we go. He asks, oh Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? How long? Let me just ask you a straightforward question. Have you ever been disappointed with God? Have you ever felt like in the midst of what you're going through, God had turned his back and was indifferent to your situation? Well, of course, if we're honest, I mean, that's what loss does. It makes us feel like God has turned his back, abandoned, and does not care. Whether we're talking about the loss of a dream or the loss of security or the loss of a business. I mean, there are times where we're like, God, I'm showing up to church in person or I'm watching online. I give faithfully. I volunteer. Like, I'm doing my best to do what you want me to do, and now you are nowhere to be found. It is essential that we grieve our losses. We have an entire book in our Bible called Lamentations, right? Lament. It is a book filled with the writings that express humiliation and despair that the Jewish people felt over the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. But the temptation for all of us when we're experiencing these emotions that are so uncomfortable and actually cause a lot of anguish inside of us is to ignore them, right? We're feeling the hurt, the pain, the sadness, the resentment, and so we want to escape. We want to go to some fantasy world, some magical place, and just not have to think about it. So I have a 22-year-old daughter by the name of Alyssa. Right? Alyssa is a colorful personality, to say the least. 2 months ago, or a couple of months ago, back in August actually, she calls me and she's like frantic and she says, Dad, I need your help finding a cheap plane ticket to Seattle. I said, all right, slow down, settle down. Why do you need a plane ticket to Seattle? She goes, I have to go see a 21 Pilots concert there. It's in September, okay? And I was confused because less than a week prior, I knew Alyssa was in Minneapolis at a 21 Pilots concert. She had actually camped out on the sidewalk in a tent for a few days because she wanted to be in the front by the pit. And so she was obsessed. And I said, okay, listen, you just took off time from work. Now you're talking about in less than a month, taking time off again, buying a plane ticket, going to Seattle, having to get a rental car. This is not good use of your money. Besides that, Alyssa, do you forget you owe me money? So you don't have money in your checking account. You don't have this. Now you want to go to Seattle. I kid you not. Next thing that happens is I see this post on Twitter. She posted. She said, I asked my dad how I can get a cheap flight to Seattle for last concert of Icy Tour, and he tried to turn it into a TED Talk about financial responsibility. Yeah, this is what we do with reality. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to deal with the finance. I want to do what I want to do, right? Now, thankfully, she ended up listening to me, but I'm telling you, it's so easy in the moments that we're confronted with the reality of our losses to try to medicate our losses in order to numb the pain, or even more frequently, we often minimize our losses and just act like it's not that big of a deal. But when we medicate our losses or we minimize them and we try to find ways to escape them, the fact is they don't go away. When we fail to really grieve our losses, what happens is we bury our emotions alive. So they may be buried, but they're still alive, which means at some point they are going to come back, and often they come back stronger and with more power, and they have greater consequences. Right, 75 years ago in this country, 100 years ago, industrialists, they didn't think any big thing happened when you put toxic waste underground. They just bury it, right? That's going to go away over time. But of course, we've since learned that burying toxic waste doesn't make it go away. It makes the problem worse. It leaks into our water, it contaminates crops, kills animals. Well, that's what happens when we bury grief, which is why one of the ways that we can know we've buried our emotions alive and we haven't grieved a specific loss is when our responses to something are disproportionate to what actually happened. Whether it's we're on edge all the time, or we've just completely secluded ourselves from other people, or something little happens and we blow up and we're angry. 6 years ago, the church that I pastor went through a series of what I consider losses. We have 2 campuses, the largest of our campuses. We were meeting in a leased facility, and they had to do a remodel. And so in the course of 1 year, we moved that campus 6 different times. In the course of moving, as you can imagine, we've lost hundreds of people and hundreds of thousands of dollars in giving. Simultaneous to that, our Racine campus, we lost the campus pastor who had been with us for 5 years. It was complete chaos, and it was affecting me. It was affecting my attitude, and I was bringing it home. And so my marriage was in the worst place it had ever been in the history of us being together. And there was a day where my wife said, I can't do this anymore. You're either going to get help or I have to leave. And so I agreed, and we got on a plane. We flew to Florida for a week-long marriage therapy. And during one of our sessions, as my wife opened up about the ways that I talked to her and I treated her, the therapist looked at me and he said, Dave, you told me earlier about the crazy amount of losses that your church experienced over the last year. Have you ever connected the dots between what you're going through at church and how you're talking to your wife and treating her and the stress that you're bringing home? You're making her the issue. Have you ever considered the fact that she's not really the issue? I said, I haven't considered that. And the therapist said, well, Dave, you might be right. Maybe it is your wife. Maybe, no, he didn't say that, right? He didn't. He said, Dave, I'm telling you what's happening here. And that began the journey of healing in our marriage. We left, and I had to realize that, dude, these are my issues that I have to deal with. We're 6 years removed from that, and our marriage is the best it's ever been. Don't talk to my wife about it. Just trust me. It's the best it has ever been, right? But here's the deal, guys. Suppressing our emotions, ignoring our emotions, doesn't make them go away. Eventually they grow, and they grow into anger or resentment. A lot of times they grow into indifference. They grow into irritability. They grow into just detaching ourselves from others. Not paying attention to our emotions has consequences. So let me put it this way. Everyone around us will eventually feel what we fail to grieve. Which means that your future as a great employee, your future as a great employer, your future as a great coworker, your future as a great husband or great wife, as a great parent, your future as a great child, As a great student, your future, my future, is contingent upon our ability to deal with our emotions in a healthy way. Emotions are not a bad thing, right? They're messengers. They're trying to alert us to something. And so we need to pay attention to them. Now, that being said, everyone grieves differently. You'll learn this in the grieving process, that there are going to be some people who grieve very much in an outward and expressive way. You get around them and it's just obvious they are going through something. There are others who, based on their personality, their temperament, they grieve inwardly. Some people, they talk a lot about their loss. Other people talk very little about their loss. Some people, when they grieve, are grieving the loss of what was. Other people are grieving the loss of what could have been. So I saw this when my brother was killed, right? And everyone in our family grieved differently. And it was hard for me because those who are not grieving in a more expressive and outward way, I just assume, well, they're not grieving. Why do they not see what's happening here? Do they not care at the same level I do? But over time, you realize everyone grieves differently. So let's just talk about my parents for a moment. My mom had this, crazy breakdown when the Marines showed up to her door. But when I showed up just a couple days later to the house, the entire week of the funeral, I never once saw my mom cry or get all that emotional. She was busy. She kept cleaning. She kept just doing things around the house. She was cooking for everybody, and everybody say, "You need to not do that. We want to do that for you." She said, "Just let me do it. I just need to stay occupied right now." My dad, he withdrew from everybody. He went into his office. He'd lock the door. You hear him in there crying. Myself, I grieved by just reading articles about his death and putting together pictures from over the years and putting together some video to show at the funeral. That was how I grieved. I had some brothers, because there's 5 of us brothers and 1 sister, some brothers who literally didn't say anything about it. They were there, they were present, but they just didn't talk. I have a sister who social media was relatively new, but was posting everything on social media. Everyone grieves differently. And that's okay, but what's important is that in our grieving process, even though we grieve differently, that we work to do it in healthy ways. And so I just want to walk through 4 ways, and we'll do this relatively quickly here, 4 ways that we can grieve in a healthy way. The first is this: pay attention to the losses in our life. Pay attention to them. Now, I know this sounds obvious, right? It's like, man, if I lost a job, it's obvious. I know it's there. I don't know that I have to work to pay attention to it. No, we do. And the reason why is because often the real loss is not the job itself. That's a loss. But we're realistic. There's other jobs out there. We're realistic. Eventually, we're going to move on. We can get there in our mind, right? But often the real loss is something different. Sometimes it's the embarrassment of losing the job. Other times it's the loss of security that job provided. It's the fear of the future and the unknowns. So the real losses may not be what's so obvious, right? If you go through the loss of a friendship, sure, you lost a friendship, but often it's the loss of other friendships connected to that friendship. It's the loss of the meaning that friendship brought you. Often when a friendship breaks apart, it's because trust has been destroyed, and now you've lost trust in that relationship. If I cannot identify loss, eventually what's going to happen is it's going to own me, and so it's important to identify what it is that we really lost. Something else we need to remember if we're going to grieve in a healthy way is that we don't need to make sense of the loss. Don't try to make sense of it. And the reason why is because most of our losses aren't going to make sense. So we can connect the dots as best as we can in our minds. But come on, losing someone in the prime of their life, not going to make sense. Someone losing their sharp mind and their quick wit to dementia or Alzheimer's, it's not going to make sense. I have a friend right now, never smoked a day in his life, diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Doesn't make sense. And even if we could explain it away scientifically, or we could explain it away logically and say, well, this is the reason why someone went through the stop sign, they hit the car, it doesn't make the loss any easier to deal with. Job, who I alluded to earlier, when he experienced this avalanche of losses in his life, he had some friends that showed up and sat with him, and together they all tried to figure out why Job was experiencing so many losses. They tried to figure it out from theological perspective, from practical perspectives, and his friends are saying, well, Job, maybe you made God angry. Maybe you aren't living a certain way. And Job is trying to make sense. He's saying, no, I am living the way I should be. I know I'm a godly man. I know I prioritize him. And it's crushing him. And eventually, Job comes to this conclusion. He says, here's the deal. God is not mortal like me, so I cannot argue with him or take him to trial. And I love this because in this section of verses, Job is saying, if I could bring God to court, I would. If I could stand and give defense of myself in front of some sort of judge, I would do it because I know I'm innocent. A little while later, he unleashes his feelings toward God, and he says, all right, tell me, what have I done? Show me my rebellion and my sin. Why do you turn away from me? Why do you treat me as your enemy? Because if my life is falling apart, if I'm going through loss after loss, there's got to be some sort of reason. Have I sinned? Have I done evil? Most of the time, the losses in our life are not going to make any sense, right? We're not going to be able to point to any logical reason we should endure the pain that we're enduring. And so it tends to happen in those moments because we do want to make sense or we want to lighten the mood that people are going through and help maybe encourage them. What happens is we come up with often little phrases to help us deal with the weight of our losses. And we see it mostly in how we communicate to people in their loss, right? So someone loses a person they love to death, and we say things like, well, God needed another angel in heaven, right? He must have needed another golfer up there, right? At least we know they're in a better place. Or we see someone being crushed under unbearable stress, and we say things like, well, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. You can do this. Or someone's relationship ends in divorce, and not too long after that, we start saying things like, well, there's other fish in the sea, right? Your ex is going to see what kind of catch you were. When they start seeing you, move on, right? When someone loses their job, we say things like, man, the economy's great. You'll find a job. You always land on your feet. And those things, we need to encourage each other. But a lot of those things need to be spoken well past the actual event of the loss, because what happens is often we unintentionally trivialize people's loss with little phrases and by trying to make sense of what happened. And part of grieving, and in a healthy way, is giving up control and realizing that loss doesn't always make sense. It rarely makes sense. Another thing we need to do if we're going to grieve in a healthy way is to ensure we don't rush the grieving process. Experts tell us that when someone experiences a significant loss, that it typically takes somewhere between 18 and 24 months before they start to heal. And the temptation for all of us is to rush through the grieving process because we want to get over the loss. I think we've all realized by now, we will never get over the loss. We get through the loss day by day by day. Let's just think about it in a practical way, right? Someone loses their spouse. The hardest part of the grieving process is not the funeral and picking out the cemetery and picking out the gravestone. And that's not the most difficult part. Actually, the funeral, at the time of the funeral, most people are just numb. And everything's a fog, and they barely can remember who showed up and words that were said. I mean, they know people were there and they felt encouraged. But what happens is after the funeral, when they have to start making calls to Social Security or calling about annuity checks or life insurance checks, or finding out there is no life insurance, that's often when the real grieving starts. It's calling the utility companies and taking names of our spouse off the bills. It's then going through spouse's clothing and belongings and giving things away or selling them. I mean, it's just this entire checklist that has to be done. And then what happens is 9 months or a year later, when you finally are like, man, I'm at the end of the checklist, I'm done. Often, those who've lost a spouse will say that's when the cards and the phone calls start slowing down. And so, grief is a long process. It is a fog, and it's sometimes hard to see what's in front of your face. And then we do things, and this is okay. I understand why we do these things. We do things to help us deal with the grieving process. So we talk about grief as though it's a stage in life, right? It's kind of like elementary school. You graduated, now you're at the next stage. And that can be helpful, and I think we need books, and we need to talk like that. But in reality, come on, we all know this. Grief doesn't work that way. It's not like you go through a period where you're sad, and then you're angry, and then you're in denial, and then you're confused, and then you're all better, and you'll live happily ever after, and there's a bow on top of the package. That is not the way grief works. You can experience all of those emotions at one time. There are still days where a song will come on the radio, or I'll be driving by something, and my memory of my brother will be triggered, and it's like, man, I thought I had moved past this. Nope. So it's important we do not rush the grieving process. The fourth and final thing we need to remember, if we're going to grieve in a healthy way, and we got to remind ourselves of it over and over and over, is to never, ever, ever lose hope. Because in true loss, things feel hopeless all the time. One of the many themes that we see surface over and over and over in the scriptures is that with God, when something dies and is buried, there is always hope of a resurrection. We died to the old, but we're resurrected to something new, something different, something meaningful. It's not the same, but it's something new. And so Jesus says to his disciples, in this world, you will have trouble. And then he goes on, he says, but take heart. I have overcome the world. You're going to have trouble, but take heart. If you include me, if I'm a part of your life, I want you to know you can have peace in the midst of sorrow and in the midst of chaos. You can have joy in the midst of difficulty. You can have hope in the midst of loss. So there's a form of art that exists in our world called trash art, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Art composed from trash and things that have been thrown away. This is what God wants to do with our life. He wants to take the things that we hate, the things we wish we never went through, the losses in our life, and say, all right, I'm going to make something from them. I want to take the ashes of your life and make something meaningful and beautiful from them. Things die, they get buried, but they get resurrected to something new. So my brother's wife is now remarried. 2 beautiful children. He's a great guy. He's not as good looking or funny as my brother is, but he is a great guy. And she's had to come to terms with, my old life's dead, it's buried, but I've been resurrected to something new. I mentioned earlier, and I'll close with this, I pastor Great Lakes Church in Kenosha, Wisconsin. For more than a decade, the concept of Great Lakes Church was in my heart. And yet every time that I would go forward and try to start this and come up with a plan, I get chicken out. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I just was afraid, always terrified. And my brother Rick was the biggest proponent of trying to get this church going. So he'd call me from Iraq. The last phone call I had with him was about, man, we got to get this church going. And so he talked me into, in one of our conversations, he says, all right, if you fly back to Kenosha and you share this dream of starting a church with some people, I'll make sure my friends are there. So he's in Iraq. He calls many of his friends, says, Dave's going to be in Kenosha. He's going to share a vision about starting a new church. I want you there. So I fly back March of 2008 to share a dream of starting a church. And I'm surrounded by Rick's friends, but Rick isn't there. Rick's wife is there, but Rick is not there. So I talk about this dream, and all of his friends are like, Dave, we're in, we're excited. I fly back to Seattle. I get so scared again, I call every one of the friends who said we're in, I said, we're not doing it. I said, now's not the right time. And I use very spiritual language, right? I feel like God just wants me to put this on hold in this season. In reality, I was just terrified. Well, a month later, I am back. Rick had been killed, and I was back to speak at his funeral. And here's just a 10-second clip of me speaking at his funeral, and I want you to know what's happening in me at this moment. I'm telling you, is something's coming alive. And it was at that funeral that I decided, all right, I'm going to do this. I told my wife, as we were driving away from the funeral, I said, Randy, we're going to start this church. I don't know. I was speaking, something came alive inside of me. 4 months later, I was back in Kenosha, had moved from Seattle, ready to do this thing. Our story of grief has the potential to become a story of anger, hatred, bitterness, and hurt that gets into our hearts and we carry it with us everywhere we go, or it has the potential to become a story of hope, healing, and resurrection. In this world, we will have trouble, but take heart. He has overcome this world. Take heart, whatever loss you're going through, whatever thing in your life you have seen die and is now buried, you have hope of being resurrected to something new and something meaningful and something significant. In just a moment, I'm going to pray. In fact, I invite you to join me in standing right now. I'm going to pray, and then I invite you to join us in singing this final song. It's a prayerful song that invites God's Spirit to fill us up and to rest on us and to move over us. And that's what we need most in our season of loss. Our Heavenly Father, I pray for my friends here at Eastlake Church, those watching or listening online. I pray for them. Pray for those at our different campuses and those in our movement. All the different stories of loss that are represented. And I pray in the name of Jesus that in our loss, you would help us to find ways to grieve in healthy and productive ways. And that you would help us as we move and get through our loss. Surround us with the right people at the right time to encourage us and to uplift us. I speak hope and healing over all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.